Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Max and Stacy are in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Loving it. This country is phantasmagorical. The people are extraordinary. The government and the central bank, maybe not so much, particularly the central bank. But let's get into this a little bit more detail. Stacy.
It doesn't matter if they have a central bank. The fact is they are under the control of IMF and the US dollar, so it doesn't matter regardless. The individual, however, could always have their sovereignty. That is something that why we're here. We're going to Uruguay in a few days, and we're going to speak at a Bitcoin conference. Bitcoin is pretty huge here. And just to remind people, we are in Argentina, even though Max is wearing a Colombian tie.
Colombia.
That looks like a tie of the flag of Colombia. And just to remind people that the GDP in 2018 here was 518 billion, down from 637 billion in 2017. That's mostly due to their currency falling. They took a $57 billion loan out from the IMF, of which about 44 billion has been paid. They did also issue in June of 2017 a 100-year bond, and it was oversubscribed. They sold 2.75 billion worth at a 7.9% yield. All those people are down by over half. And into this situation, so, you know, we are outsiders. We're trying to observe what we see here and just be aware that you should do your own research, of course, because it's difficult as an English speaker without much Spanish to know fully all of the players and what's going on here.
You know what sucks here?
What?
The ATM fees. It's like 10% and higher.
Over 10%.
You know, take out $100 or whatever.
No, because you're only allowed to take out $85.
A day.
Yeah.
And they charge you 10%.
Yeah, they charged me $11.50 to take out that $85.
I was thinking about interest rate apartheid because for me, because I have an elite bank account, I get reimbursed for all ATM fees, no matter where I am in the world. So my fees are zero. Other people, it's 10, 11, 12%. I mean, this is absurd. This is just negative interest rates. They've already imposed a negative interest rate at the ATM machine.
The people of Argentina are used to this, and so you don't see lines out the banks. You don't see them paying those absurd fees because they've already protected themselves in other ways. It's just people like us who wander into this situation who are the imbeciles that will pay that. So I'm sure they don't pay that sort of fee because they're more clever than we are because we're used to the easy life of America, right? Except for where you might go bankrupt because of healthcare. But nevertheless, I'm going to look at, you know, the situation from America. You always hear like it's the Kirchners and it's the left-wing people like the Kirchners or the Peronists that ruin this country. And just looking through all the data I've been able to find online, it was quite shocking how actually different it was than what the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times, which trickles down to CNN and MSNBC and Fox News in America, the disinfo. Here's a tweet from Kate Long, and she's referring to an article from China News Asia. Debt soared by about $100 billion under Macri and now exceeds 90% of GDP. At the time of his election in 2017, debt to GDP was just 38% of GDP. In American-dominated media, you always hear like that this guy was some great savior and it business-friendly. And it's like, well, if business-friendly means racking up debt like that fast, $100 billion and a $500 billion economy in just a few years is insane.
Keep in mind that the debt to global GDP is 240%.
Yeah.
And the people who think that's good are the people who sell debt, sell bonds.
Yeah, but those are also people who get free access to the New York Fed, so they could manage that debt so easily. Here, if you're outside of it, the further you are from the New York Fed, this is the Cantillon effect. This is in action on a nation-state level. If you get free money from the Fed that operates the entire global fiat debt system, then you're living large. If you're outside it, it's just like something like the dollar soaring as it did in the past 2 years will cause total crisis in your country unless you take on more debt.
When you mention America, of course, you're referring to North America.
Yeah, when I say America, I mean North America.
North America, right. We have to be,
they don't like
to be
me.
clear about that, because this is America, too.
Yes, I've noticed they don't like us calling themselves.
The United States.
Yeah.
The U.S.
I don't mean Americans like those people in the United States who like to refer to themselves as Americans.
But it's like those ATM fees, right? So in other words, the interest rates on this debt, if you have access at certain privileged windows over there at the central bank, it doesn't mean anything to you. But for everyone else, they have to deal with the economic fallout from all this financial vandalism.
But that's a little microcosm of the macro story. What we're saying here is, like, here they're paying 7.9% on their 100-year bonds, and who knows how much to the IMF, and austerity measures and all sorts of plunder of the country as a result of the IMF loan. So yeah, the cost is very high at a certain level. It's negative interest rates in Europe and free money in Europe. But here we have this situation. And then I'm going to look at this tweet stream from Branko Milanovic. He is a really good writer, economist about, in particular, inequality. And he's written lots of papers on inequality. The real root cause to the Argentinian crises, plural, is, in my opinion, extremely high inequality and social polarization. The right finds free market policies in its interest and believes they may also bring some trickle down, but the trickle down just does not happen. And then B, the Peronist left then comes to power, targets directly an increase in the incomes of the poor, which in turn provokes a reaction from the rich until they come to power and do A again, i.e. free market policies. If something is happening for 70 years with regularity, the real cause cannot lie in the most recent policies, be they government or IMF.
This is an interesting look at how free markets work. So free markets, by that definition, are markets, as we've described it, a certain group of people get free money. And some of that free money, they believe, will trickle down to the masses, but it never does. They just get fabulously rich. As we see in America right now, the concentration in the plutocracy is getting ever more concentrated and with fewer and fewer folks. So that's not really free markets. That's a kleptocracy that he's describing. The kleptocracy creates a populist backlash, and the populist backlash usually, puts the flag of socialism in the ground because they think that's the opposite of quote-unquote free markets, and that's a centralized attempt to dictate price signals into an economy, and of course that never works either. So they're both sides. It's a kleptocracy versus a centralized socialist system. They're both equally wrong. If you have an actual free market, you would have price discovery happening at the margin, which means that you have distribution of risk and reward equally throughout the society, and you have an organic kind of, during the gold standard is when you have an actual free market society. And for 100 years of the gold standard, the global economy did great under a gold standard. Once you left the gold standard, you had a kleptocracy and socialism.
Actually, during the gold standard, we're going to look at that. Before 1971, there was a global gold standard. It does not matter. You still can have thugs. You can still have thugs who come in and take your gold. You can still have thugs who control. In the United States, we had the robber baron era was under the gold standard. And how do you get that thuggery? And that's important to this economy because and I think the Wikipedia on the Argentine economy is very simple. It just lays out all the progress, essentially from 1880, when they had mass migration. Over 10 million Europeans fled all the conflict in Europe between, World War I, World War II. They all fled here, mostly Italian. But, these are dedicated people with capital. They brought a lot of capital. The country here was only 2 million people. 10 million came in from Europe, and it was a boom time. So that's when you hear about that fabled time of it being the third wealthiest country in the world. This is when they brought all the capital, all their gold, all their wealth from Europe, and then they landed here.
Right, but let's talk about thuggery under a gold standard is limited by physical constraints. If you're trying to grab territory through violence, there's a certain limitation to that, the limitations of physical dimension. But when you have thuggery by fiat money and imaginary money, it's unlimited. So you have countries like in South America, in Argentina, that are foisted with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of fake debt. And in exchange for that, as we know from the Economic Hitman, John Perkins' book, you send the debt in, then you grab all the territory. So it's unlimited thuggery versus limited thuggery under a gold standard.
What happened next was the Great Depression. And the Great Depression hit here particularly hard. It hit everywhere in the world hard, some harder than others. Here it got hit, and it sank down within the top 15 wealthiest nations in the world during that time. Juan Perón came in during World War II in 1945. He nationalized a lot of things, and this is where we always refer to the left wing here, the socialist sort of system here. But the economy did grow fivefold under him until 1976, and the population grew twofold. So there was high inflation, but the economy grew faster than the population. So it was kind of real wealth being created. It was increasing at 3.8% every single year over that time. So what you see clearly, however, in 1976, when the U.S.-backed coup happened, the entire economy just was destroyed by the time they left in 1983. You had 400,000 small and medium-sized enterprises and bigger enterprises just go out of business, 400,000. You had mass capital flight. You had massive tax evasion. It was total corruption. They split the economy up into their buddies and looted the country, with Henry Kissinger playing a major role. And Henry Kissinger is important still to this day, as you saw Howard Stern and Hillary Clinton saying he's the gold standard. He said he's the gold standard of international diplomats. And this guy, Henry Kissinger, says you, Hillary Clinton, are the best ever Secretary of State. So this is just a reminder of what we've done. This is from The Guardian in 2003 or 4. Kissinger approved Argentinian dirty war. Henry Kissinger gave his approval to the dirty war in Argentina in the 70s, in which 30,000 people were killed, according to newly declassified U.S. State Department documents. Mr. Kissinger, who is America's Secretary of State, is shown to have urged the Argentinian military regime to act before the U.S. Congress resumed session and told that Washington would not cause it unnecessary difficulties. There's actual transcripts that show that he was like, hurry up and kill as many people, kill the opposition as fast as possible before the American people notice and complain to their Congress. So make sure you do it fast.
Right. What made Henry Kissinger's soft genocide in Argentina possible was Nixon, of course, closed the gold window in 71. He was Nixon's boy.
Yes.
And they went off the gold standard in 71. And by 76, Kissinger had all the money, fiat money and debt at his disposal to go into Argentina and create massive havoc using fiat money. Is the ultimate tool of the terrorist is fiat money.
He had a lot of practice up until then in Cambodia, the slaughter there. Of course, in Chile, the revelations are likely to further damage Mr. Kissinger's reputation. He has already been implicated in war crimes committed during his term in office, notably in connection with the 1973 Chilean coup. Regardless of what anybody says in the media, and they tend to, even MSNBC will take a right-wing slant, is the fact is that that military coup and the crisis they caused, the hollowing out of the economy and business, they were like the GRG, the RBS GRG group of Argentina. They wiped out 400,000 businesses.
Right, 9/11, 1973,
yes.
When the U.S. staged a coup in Chile. Again, 1971, demarcation, paper gold versus gold thug. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to our conversation with Nick Giambruno from Casey Research and the International Man. Welcome back.
Hey, great to be here, Max.
All right, let's dive right into it. We ended our last conversation talking about gold. Let's continue. You write that central banks will push gold higher in 2020. How important is that? They actually taking physical delivery. How is this different in previous years? Is this another trick bag, Nick? Is gold going to be asleep in 2020 again, or is this the real thing?
Yes, I think this is the start of the real thing, because it's a lot of indications, but I think this is the biggest one because central banks are the biggest players in the gold market here, and they've not only switched from being net sellers of gold to net buyers a handful of years ago, but that has turned into record buys, and not just buying paper, they're taking physical delivery in their own country. So they're not just storing it in New York, they're not just storing it in London, they're saying, hey, we want to have the real stuff here in Poland, here in Germany, and Italy too. So it's a very important thing. Why is it important? It's important because when the gold market, seeing these kinds of trends in the gold market often is an indicator that some sort of big shift in the international monetary system is coming. We saw the same kind of thing in the lead up to 1971, of course, when Nixon took the dollar completely off the gold standard. So that was or excuse me, completely decoupled the dollar from gold. That's the more accurate way to put it. But that was preceded by France and European countries. You know, they knew the U.S. couldn't hold the $35 an ounce. There were way too many dollars that they had printed. So they saw that kind of the game was up, and they started to take physical delivery, and that broke the system. I think that's the same kind of pattern we're seeing here today. It hasn't really kind of broken the system and caused gold to break out yet, but I think the warning signs are clearly there with the record buying by central banks and then also the physical delivery, which is very important.
Right, we're seeing probably the end of two big cycles going back of decades. The 71 cycle that you mentioned, Nixon disavowed the tie between the dollar and gold, broke it, and essentially defaulted on U.S. debt. I mean, they talk about Argentinians defaulting on their debt, or whether they should. Argentinians should recall that America defaulted on its sovereign debt in 1971 by disconnecting the association with gold. So, I mean, if the United States can do it, why can't Argentina default on their IMF loans?
No.
There's nothing sacrosanct about those types of paper that's unbacked to begin with.
Absolutely, yes. That is a very important point. People don't realize that that was a default. If you promise somebody to pay them in gold, and then you're like, oops, sorry, just kidding, I'm going to give you these pieces of paper I just created out of thin air, that's a default, you know,
Right.
no matter what you call it.
And they say,
that's a default.
Argentina can't default on their IMF loan. Well, the United States defaulted hugely, bigly, in 1971. People do it all the time, and it doesn't destroy your credit rating. As a matter of fact, Argentina went right back into the credit market and did a 100-year bond because there's always going to be an insatiable thirst. But anyway, so the 71 is when central banks started to be net sellers of gold, because it looked like the world was going on a U.S. dollar reserve standard, and that gold was not going to really be the thing you want in your central bank. That has reversed. Now, in the last couple of years, central banks are buying gold in not since the early 70s in the quantities that they're buying gold. They're net buyers of gold. They're not selling their national gold. The other major cycle that seems to be turning here, Nick, is the neoliberal cycle introduced by Reagan-Thatcher era of this deregulatory hyper empire building using paper and debt that Reagan and Thatcher introduced by essentially giving the banks free rein to make all the mistakes that they wanted to do, and then they can just paper them over with money. So they basically said, as was later codified by the Obama administration, that banks would not be subject to any rule of law. That started under Reagan and Thatcher. But now it looks like that's also turning, that the law of the marketplace is coming back. The law of the price signaling of gold is coming back. And so both of these cycles are turning. And if we're heading back to a commodity where commodity has real value, then doesn't that favor a country like Argentina?
Absolutely, because Argentina is a commodity producer. You know, the beef here, it's not just beef. Argentina has plenty of natural resources. They have uranium here. They have lots of energy here. Argentina is big on commodities. So, but I think you're absolutely right. And yes, the banks are above the law. I mean, even before that, it's when you have a license to legally counterfeit, that's above the law. If you did that, if I did that, if I ran a fractional reserve shoe store, I'd go to jail. But banks have this license to engage, and they've had it for, you know, since 1913 or maybe even earlier. They've had it for a very long time. But yes, I do think there is a turning against these institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which, you know, they do horrible things. They're not based on sound economics. They're based on, you know, basically they're tools the U.S. uses as part of their foreign policy.
It's so grotesque when you hear about helicopters with pallets full of $100 bills being airdropped into Iraq after the U.S. kills 500,000 people. It's like the Zyklon B of the 21st century is America's fiat dollar. And they just go around the world and murder people with it. It's so gross.
Yes, it's terrible. Well, if the Iraqis really wanted to do something about it, they'd send those dollars back and they'd accept gold or Bitcoin for their oil instead of dollars for their sales.
Bitcoin is impossible to counterfeit.
Yes.
But it also doesn't need a third party to verify it.
Yes.
So in a lot of ways, it's better than gold. Over there at Keiser Research, you guys, I think Keiser was a bit resistant to Bitcoin initially, and I think he's more on board now. We'll get into that some other time.
Yes.
But in the case of gold, this trend of repatriation seems to be gaining pace. These countries are saying, we don't want it stored in U.S. or in Britain. We want it back. We want it home. Poland, Turkey, all these countries. We want the gold in our vaults. Is that going to continue?
Oh, absolutely. It's going to accelerate. And what's going to accelerate that, ironically, is the actions of the U.S. government. When they lay sanctions on people, they try to cut people off from the dollar system. What is that? I mean, they're shooting themselves in the foot. Not that I want the U.S. to be a more efficient empire. I don't. I want it to disintegrate as an empire. But nonetheless, they're taking, they're doing these self-inflicted wounds when they're cutting people off from the dollar. They're doing these sanctions.
The SWIFT cut off and the sanctionings and all that going on. So these other countries are saying, well, actually, you know, we can create our own SWIFT in like 20 minutes. We don't need your stupid SWIFT.
Exactly.
And so the U.S. loses. They're so stupid. So Goldman Sachs recently noted that now is the time to buy gold, but also there were large unexplained flows of gold, that is to say large buyers, but not in the exchange-traded funds or any publicly announced purchases. What is going on there?
Some big player sees the same kind of big picture trends that we've been talking about, and the what's going on in the world, geopolitically, financially, culturally. You know, this is the perfect environment for gold. So I'm not surprised that there are big buyers of gold, and these kinds of details are important. But for me, in my analysis of the situation, what is important is the fundamentals. And the fundamentals for gold are as strong as ever and getting stronger.
Well, China says they've got 3,000 tons. Is that true, or do they have more?
Well, I would say that's probably not true.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a big surprise yet to come. So, you know, is gold entering its third leg of the bull market? Since 2000, it's been now the first two legs. You know, bull markets tend to go in three spasms. The third spasm of a bull market tends to be the most parabolic, if you will. Are we now at the beginning, after getting over 1,500, ready to go? Someone I saw in the market made a huge call on a 4,000 price of gold coming up in the next year or so. That's pretty aggressive. That would be a big move. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I think possibly yes, but I think even more important than the dollar price of gold and making forecasts on that is looking at the underlying fundamentals, as we talked about earlier. And what's going to turbocharge this gold bull market, unlike one that we have probably seen in all of our lifetimes, is what's driving this gold bull market is the remonetization of gold. This isn't just a cyclical gold bull market. We're talking about a trend of the remonetization of gold, and out of all the things we've talked about, that's the underlying trend. Gold is coming back as money. That's the big deal. That's the big picture. Whether it takes 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years to happen, that's ultimately what's going to happen, and I think that's what people need to pay attention to.
A couple of points there. Number one, it's never been not monetized. If you look at the central bank level, they always settle in gold. They've always used gold as money. Number two, using gold-backed money, the first country that does that wins the 21st century. So the first country to back their currency with gold, I'm hearing China is launching a crypto-backed currency backed by gold. And they're going to also announce they've got 20,000 tons of gold. And that effectively it's going to be like a Pearl Harbor moment, and they're going to make a move on the United States and the world to be number one. Okay, that would be monetization of gold. But Russia's also in the mix because they've been buying lots and lots of gold. So it's fair to say the first country that makes the move is going to have a huge comparative advantage in the 21st century.
Absolutely, and I think it's China's already made some incremental moves, as you've noted. But even more important than that, what's really underpinned the dollar as the world's reserve currency since Nixon took it completely off of gold in 1971 has been this petrodollar system, whereby the U.S. has this partnership with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia sells all its oil only in dollars. Well, that creates a lot of artificial demand for dollars. So when Saudi sells oil to China, China has to pay Saudi in dollars. Well, that creates demand for dollars. Well, China doesn't like that. And what China created and has been trying to do for many years, but actually launched last year, was a direct attack on this petrodollar system. China launched an oil's futures trading contract denominated in yuan that is immediately convertible into physical gold via the gold exchanges in Shanghai and Hong Kong. So they've already laid the groundwork for this attack that you're talking about.
The petrodollar is under threat.
Yes.
And Saudi Arabia is selling Saudi Aramco as a public offering. And they'll have a lot of fiat money. If they start buying gold now, that would totally put the kibosh on the dollar.
It would, but they won't, and I'll tell you why. Because Donald Trump said something that was actually true. He said without the cloak of American protection, Saudi Arabia would disappear within a week or so. And he's totally right. So the Saudis won't do anything that will anger the Americans too much because they lose that umbrella of protection. Maybe they can try to get the Russians or the Chinese to do it, but really they're tied at the hip with the Americans, and I don't really see them making a decisive break. They could, but that doesn't matter because China is the largest oil consumer, the largest oil importer, and they're moving away from dollar transactions, and that's huge. With this exchange, and then of course, as you noted too before, this pipeline that's now, this energy pipeline between Russia and China that is now active, they're not transacting in dollars on that. So what you really want to look to as the signs for China launching this attack on the dollar that you're talking about is energy. Look at how energy is priced, and this is a big indication.
Nick Giambruno from Keiser Research. You can find your work on that website. And International Man, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Nick Giambruno from Keiser Research. If you'd like to find us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.